So let's diverge a little bit into and dig a little deeper into the social experience. So again, this is going beyond just playing having a chat program or playing a social character. There are now a lot of ways that we have shared experiences within games. So Jane McGonigal describes players as expert collaborators, and there's some great stories in her book about people sort of achieving these exceptional goals, these sort of really amazing numbers by aggregate, right? And you see a lot of interesting stories coming out of EVE Online, for instance, is one where um, people are forming these large organizations that are actually amassing large amounts of value that almost match small countries in terms of the sort of GDP equivalents that are occurring. Similar kinds of things happen with World of Warcraft and even just standard multiplayer games like League of Legends and Halo. In fact, I think Jane McGonigal's story is about Halo. So people are shared collaborators or expert collaborators when they come into games, but they also sort of build a baseline of trust. So we talked about the fact that uh, everybody kind of agrees to abide by the rules when they come into a game, and so you get this baseline of everyone's agreeing to the rules because you kind of have to. For the most part, you might try to violate the rules or find the edge cases of the rules, um, but for the most part, you're already agreeing to play by the rules when you come in. And so you get this baseline of trust, you get this sort of shared camaraderie of we're all playing the game, right? And so what happens is that you actually get a lot of things that are built around the game or in the culture of the game that can be sometimes helped to reinforce. So often modern games actually help to enable streamers, help to allow wikis to be created. And you'll see that a lot of people spend a lot of time on, say, wikis to teach strategies. League of Legends I mentioned before. You don't necessarily have an expert trainer, but you do actually have a lot of material online that can help you understand, like strategy guides and things like that. It used to be that strategy guides only exist in magazines. You couldn't go search them on Google. Right? You had to call a special phone line with Nintendo to ask for help from somebody that maybe played the game over there. But nowadays, you can go to a wiki, and many players are answering questions and suggesting how to be better. League of Legends and StarCraft. Everyone actually wants to make better players, for one, because you get better competition and a more interesting game, and two, if you're going to end up playing with that person, then you want them to be good and know good strategies so they do the right thing. Um, so there's a lot of material that ends up getting written sort of extraneous to the game, or developed, or communities that evolve around it, or Discord channels, and all this kind of stuff that all builds toward a shared experience that adds to the game that people can use as part of it. And so the more you can enable that kind of thing as you think through your game, the better, because it's going to happen anyway. And so, fighting it over copyright battles, or try to charge streamers for streaming your game, or whatever else, these things are all going to kind of work against you if you don't expect them. So, kind of a different angle of the social experience. Games actually allow you to walk in someone else's shoes. So there was a game called Peacemaker, which was put out as a serious game, and it was provided to Palestinians and Israelis. And I think they always played the opposite side. So you had to be an Israeli and play as a Palestinian, or you had to be a Palestinian and you're actually playing as an Israeli. And the purpose of this game here was to show the complexity of dealing with the other person's side, essentially to walk in their shoes literally. Quite almost literally, of course, not actually walking in their shoes, but more that you're playing the game in their shoes and from their perspective, right? And understanding the complexities of their situation better, the sort of ways that their hands are tied, or the challenges that they're facing even amongst their own people, or dealing with the various influencing factors that are happening. But this is sort of a different perspective of shared experience or social experience. But standard games will let you play as the hero conquering demons or aliens, and to walk in those kinds of shoes, or to be the master battle commander of a large army, or a large force of some kind in sort of the high strategy games. But it doesn't always have to be that level of fantasy. It could be, again, like Papers, Please, or say, there's quite a few now, but where they put you into challenging situations. They give you a different perspective than you might otherwise have, help you understand how other people think. Now, I don't, this game didn't create peace in the Middle East, of course, but it did influence some changing perspective amongst people that actually tried it out. And I don't think, it was high policy decision makers, but at least some people got a different perspective about the way the other half lived in this case. And then one of the other social cues that are provided by games, besides the shared experience, the shared culture that ends up being created, the ability to sort of understand a completely different culture than your own by having another's perspective, is that you get to participate in something bigger than yourself in many cases. So sometimes, you are in the game by yourself, and your participation in something that is very large and creates that sense of wonder or awe is just the mechanic that the designer built. But on the other hand, sometimes you are participating in World of Warcraft in a massive raid. You are participating in a company in EVE Online and building something there, or you are simply participating in some large gathering of Halo players to achieve some goal, or even Minecraft and building some large structure, that you are collaborating to build something big. And so it gives you a sense of perspective of yourself that you're not a healthy one, right? That you are a part of a world that you need to participate in. You're not the most important thing always. Sometimes you are. A lot of games sort of give you that perspective, but thankfully a lot of games actually allow you to participate in amongst a group and understand your place within that group and how you can help to support it, how you can do your part, but that you're not the most important part, that you are a part of something big and can help it grow. So the more you can allow people to organize around a thing, to share with each other the accomplishments, or even to give them large and structured goals within the community to achieve, the more players can get this experience. It doesn't have to be necessarily so the example, the story that Jane McGonigal tells in her book is about Halo players trying to get 10 billion kills against the Covenant. And so interestingly, kills are just part of the game, and maybe it gets a little tedious after a while, but they achieved this within a very short amount of time. As I understand it, this wasn't necessarily something that was brought on by the developers, but they actually started tracking this as the players themselves because they wanted to do something cool and interesting. But it turns out that they needed to organize, they needed to create tutorials, they needed to put all of the sort of pieces together to make this happen. And so they did this with a game that, lives in, say, I think it had 16 or maybe up to 64 maximum players. So it's not like a massive multiplayer game. So you don't have to necessarily create a WoW or an EVE Online to allow people to participate in something bigger. You can give them ways of interacting with the community or with your game and the community at large, that they can still experience this sort of growth and maybe a longevity with your game, right? So the more people sort of identify with the culture of a game, the longer they will play it, and that can potentially be profitable for your company. So we talked about this briefly with flow and the fact that this graph moves up and down, right? And so it the tempo is the speed at which something plays. The rhythm is sort of where the peaks and valleys occur in time. And so you can look at those both together as, this is the rate and the sort of frequency of this graph, or the highs and lows of this graph. And that's what we're concerned with, right? So how quickly do you see the next boss? Where in time does that show up relative to when you last saw, or how quickly you climb the curve and of the difficulty curve toward anxiety away from boredom, or how quickly you slope back down toward boredom. All those kind of come down to the tempo and the rhythm of the game that you're building, and the way that those are going to flow into it. And then session length, of course, is just how long the game lasts. On, say, a mobile device where really the game is meant to kind of disappear into your life, your session length is usually quite short, because in order to disappear into your life, the game needs to really be playable while you're standing in line waiting for your coffee order, or you're waiting at the DMV, or you're waiting in any number of places, or you're just trying to get yourself to sleep at night and you want to play for 15 to 20 minutes. You aren't necessarily looking for a session length that's going to go much longer than 30 minutes. You're not looking for an in-depth RPG narrative story that's going to draw you in for maybe multiple hours or potentially for a really long time. You just want to play something quick that you might play 1 or 2 levels and they're done within a few minutes. And so the session length there is kind of critical to fit to what is the mobile experience. Now, mid-session length is something more like 30 minutes to, say, an hour or maybe 2 hours. And this is kind of a standard game where you're aiming at a level that you're going to have to, invest some time in, right? So a lot of levels are actually built around this idea of a mid-session length, where it will take, say, a 30-minute period or up to an hour, maybe even 2 hours if you're kind of pushing it to beat a level. But 2 hours is kind of long, right? If you think about any of the games where you played, and it's like I'm gonna go through chapter 7 now. I expect chapter 7 to take me anywhere from 30 minutes to an hour, because I'm playing the game and that's my expectation. So if I'm going to like one of the more recent Lara Croft games or Nathan Drake, something like that, I'm expecting that I'm only going to play for 30 minutes to an hour to get through a chapter. And then I know I can quit or I can play again, but I'm going to have a defined break point that says this is a good place to stop, and you can go walk around and go get a cup of coffee or a drink of water or something. You can go to the bathroom. Games that go from an hour or longer are considered long session games, right? And really there's no upper bound, and that's where the problem comes in, right? So games that have a session length where you kind of need to stay focused, you need to stay in flow for an hour or 2 hours or 4 hours or longer, can draw you in. You allow your players to arrive at a place of self-neglect where they're not showering, they're not eating, they're not going to the bathroom, they are potentially killing themselves playing your game. And so your session length should always be shorter than that. You might get away with a 2 or 4 hour session length on some really long and convoluted games. Some board games actually have session lengths that are like 4 hours long, except that with many people sitting around a physical table, it's very easy to sort of get up during somebody else's turn and walk around and step away. But it's not necessarily bad to have a game that takes 4 hours. It's kind of a nice and meaty thing that you're going to sit down and really just enjoy an evening on a Friday or Saturday night or something with a 4 hour long game. But you probably also want the game to end within that 4 hour period, right? Or maybe a 6 hour period or something. Whereas medium session length is better when built around the games that are going to be long. So if you're going to play a 40 to 80 hour game, it's better to do that in session lengths, in chapters or sequences that are 30 minutes to an hour. So you're actually playing 40 sequences within a game like that, or 80 sequences that are, not necessarily cut and dry, but there are certainly well-defined breakpoints within there where you can say, okay, I'm gonna set the game down. I've played for my 4 hours. I've played through a 4 hour session. I've got through quite a few of these chapters. I'm gonna set the game down at the end of chapter 4, or I started 1 and I got through 4 and end there. So again, think of all these things in terms of, especially flow. Flow is probably the best way to think of it. And you think of pushing towards anxiety and allowing yourself to flow, your player to flow back to boredom, to relaxation. But you also think about how long of a window they're going to hear it, right? And so if you were to bring this all the way back to music, you can have sort of a very fast and beating tempo, right? A very quick game with a very intense rhythm where it's just constant pounding. But maybe you don't want to do that for very long, right? And you could have sort of a relaxed melody where it kind of goes up and down, and then you may be allowed to play with it for a lot longer because it's a little more soothing. But any point at which you are sort of blasting notes at your player, loud and intense, should probably not go on for a very long time. So we are going to continue our descent deeper and deeper into the physical realities, right? So in a sense, we've spent this class dealing with the nitty-gritty of games, right? And especially the nitty-gritty of dynamics, of putting pieces together. And in this particular lecture, we've actually started at kind of a really high level of, what are games, and just the 4 quadrants of content, dynamics, aesthetics, mechanics that make these up. And so we've slowly been drilling back down to where we start to meet back up with all the things that we've been talking about this semester. And so now let's dig down deeper and start to look at where we start to line up. Whenever you put a series of connected pieces together, you get a system. So on the left, we get a physical system known as a pulley system in this case, or we'll refer to it as pulley system, simply because we have a rope that's connected to a ceiling, which is traveling through a pulley and allowing a person applying the effort to raise the load, right? And so the active piece is the load is raising up and down, but the full system works and has sort of a level of effort that's associated with it, which we could define. We could define how each individual piece is working, or we could define the system as a whole, the sort of output piece, which is just the load moving up and down, and figure out how much work is involved, right? And of course, we could do this kind of thing in Unreal if we really wanted to. We could actually put all these physical pieces together. So when we're thinking about all of the pieces that we have sort of developed over the semester and how these start to fit together, we need to start thinking in terms of systems. So to simplify a little bit from sort of the pulley system, we can think of more like an inflow and an outflow. So often health systems are treated this way. So we have healing factors, which are inflow and increase the stock, and we have outflow, which are the ways that you get damaged. And so when you start to look at these kinds of mechanics, you can look at just the raw numbers and say, over time, over a game session or over a certain window within the game session, how much outflow is going to happen? How much am I going to be damaged? And then based on that, you can say, well, I need this much inflow to keep my stock up to a certain level, right? Now I can allow for variance in player performance to say, well, poor performers are going to have their outflow go down, and it's going to end up emptying out the stock, and they're going to die, right? Their health is going to go to zero. Or really good performers are going to actually keep the outflow very minimalized and end up pulling up the inflow, and so the stock is going to increase very high. But you actually start to get this to narrow down into simply a variable m in, how much health am I going to get over a certain window of time, and m out, how much health am I going to lose. And I can get an m stored, or an m1, which is kind of the fixed point that I care about, and the m stored, which is actually the value that I'm either increasing or decreasing to, right? And so this is the way that game designers start to think about these things in terms of deciding how much health should each capsule have, or how much damage should my ball take when I ram into the side of a wall. You want to look at where is a novice player going to sit, and how is that going to affect the stock? How much is it going to move it down over the course of the game, over the course of a given level, especially if you have a level laid out? How much health do I need to how much health do I need to put in there? How much damage do I need to take? So you can both adjust these two values, just in the case of health in this case, right? So how much health can they earn from their capsules? How much damage will they take from their ball? All by simply just evaluating those two values through, say, a given level and how much damage you think is going to happen. Now, you should hear sort of the hand wavy part here where I'm saying, how much damage is going to happen. And of course, this all depends on how the level is played out, who's playing the level, and what kind of bad luck or good luck they have. But what you do is you play test. You actually run through the level and you start to get a sense for, if I'm a moderate player, if I'm playing at a moderate level of skill, I'm not trying to master the game too heavily, or especially as a designer, you have to kind of almost play as an average player, even though you might actually be really good at the game. You kind of have to pretend. You have to make yourself play at a certain level of skill and get a sense for how these work. Or maybe you play at a high end level of skill and you figure out what the high end is, and then you try to make sure it works and falls back. But this is where you start to be able to put these numbers into, you almost get into a spreadsheet, right? You put these numbers in a spreadsheet and you make sure they all balance out. Now we also have the consideration of loops, right? So we have what are known as balancing loops and reinforcing loops. So balancing loops tend to want to keep the stock lower, and reinforcing loops tend to want to keep the stock higher or move it higher up. these are extra features that you can build into your game to sort of keep you from going out of bounds. So in the first place, if you're setting your M in and your M out, you're trying to build it against, say, a high level player, then you could almost think of the balancing loop as increasing the number of randomly generated obstacles or even enemies that are going to show up that will start to hit the player and cause more damage to sort of balance out and sort of balance out their ability to avoid just the standard obstacles and create more damage through bringing those in. Reinforcing loops work the other way, whereas you get low enough, you allow for things to happen to increase or sort of steadily increase the flow. And this could simply be in gameplay too. It doesn't necessarily have to be like enemies are coming through. So, for example, an RPG actually tends to have, most RPG games, role-playing games, tend to have reinforcing loops. That is, that you go out, you fight some monsters, you get some treasure, you spend some of that treasure on just healing yourself back up, but overall you get sort of a little bit more treasure every time you go back out. And then you go back out again, you fight more monsters, you also get more XP, you heal yourself back up, you buy more equipment, you improve your character, and then you go back out. And so steadily your sort of overall power level is increasing over time. And that's actually a case where you want that to increase over time because that's kind of the fun part of an RPG. You don't actually want that to stay fixed. But you might also put a balancing loop in there that says that your enemies will get harder and harder. And so even though your power level is increasing, you do actually have sort of more damage coming out in any given instance, right? So you have harder enemies that are hitting harder and doing more damage to balance that out a little bit with a balancing loop. Another example of a balancing loop is in racing games where once you get far enough behind, or if the AIs get far enough behind, there's actually kind of a rubber banding effect where you will run faster, or the AIs will run faster to catch up with you. Because the interesting thing in a racing game isn't being out ahead of everybody and just racing the track. It's actually kind of interacting with the other cars and having to kind of deal with the fact that the cars are trying to come around you or get around you and pass you. And so some games will sort of modify that ability by essentially sort of treating the other car like rubber banding the cars against you. Some players feel that and hate that, and there is a certain level of you have to allow the player to sort of experience the joy of just getting out way ahead of everyone and just totally dominating the field. But there's a balancing factor, right? There's either you allow the player to experience getting way ahead of the field, or you come back and you allow them to experience the main core of the gameplay, which is kind of dealing with the other cars and having to sort of jockey for position. So I mentioned this already once, but you can imagine, especially if you're comfortable with spreadsheets, actually putting some of these numbers in and creating almost high-level equations to capture the stock and the flow. And for a given level, you could put in numbers and you could put in guesses, and you could refine those guesses based on playtests to say, well, it looks like people take XYZ damage, so why don't we ramp up our damage value a little bit here and put in this equation and see how that might change things, and then plug it back into the game and playtest again. And what you can do is, if you're very good at putting all this together, you can create a spreadsheet that almost itself describes the overall game. And so what you as a designer do, and what you will find in the industry, is that a lot of game designers do actually live within spreadsheets like this and want to put all of their numbers in spreadsheets. And in fact, Unreal has a mechanism for bringing in spreadsheets and pulling the numbers out of there, right? And so your hit points, in fact, if you go explore the Action RPG template, you will see that all of the character progression stuff, all of the hit point progression for higher levels and the amount of power that they get at those levels is all put into a spreadsheet that was potentially built in this way, but at least built with this in mind, that the designer would want to build a spreadsheet that they could just plug that spreadsheet directly into the game and have it use the numbers that it's pulling, that it's defined in the spreadsheet that the designer has built in the spreadsheet to actually give the game this sort of overall loop and growth and experience. Now, we weren't going to dig too deeply into how those happen. This is just to kind of introduce the concept and where these things start to go. But you can imagine how this might work if you consider like the simple loop. Adventurer buys equipment and potions. They enter the dungeon. They use a fight. They're gonna use up some of their potions that they did, but they gain some experience points. They gain some money. It's kind of the core loop of almost every RPG game to some degree or another. And more recently, Darkest Dungeon. Now, if you have not played Darkest Dungeon, it's got almost explicitly this loop. It's very very tight in its representation. It's very sort of apparent that it's doing this kind of loop. That you go into the dungeon, you play the fights, and you come back out. And you go back to town. And you go back to the dungeon. You do the fights and come back out. So, given this loop, we get a balancing factor where it's called Darkest Dungeon. It's actually kind of balanced against the player. So it's you do get a little more powerful, but it feels kind of devastating. Like you're sort of rather than maybe a lot of RPGs where you kind of grow in power and you get really, really powerful and you feel really good about yourself. Darkest Dungeon feels more like you're just kind of barely above the line, right? You come back and you really have to like spend almost all your money putting back all your potions and healing all your characters and getting everybody back to normal. In fact, it even takes a lot of time to heal a character, and so that even takes them out of the fight for a little while. But you tend to still have sort of sort of a reinforcing loop in Darkest Dungeon. It's just a very very minimalistic reinforcing loop, and it's really harsh and unforgiving. And that, of course, that's the design. That's what they were going after. So you can imagine, if they were building in the spreadsheet for this, that they are putting numbers that sort of have a very narrow razor margin between the good and the bad parts that are pushing on that stock value. And so remember, the designer's job here is to ride the razor's edge, right? So by playing with those numbers, by playing with the way the player's skill is going to improve over time, means that you actually have to ramp those numbers up over time to match the player. That's why RPG games are so popular, because you kind of allow the player to get new abilities that they don't quite understand, so they have to learn them and they have to master them, and so they kind of come back to sort of the lower left corner with the new skill or how they're supposed to use it. But overall, part of balancing those numbers, part of getting the stock to rise and fall, also helps you to get to that I barely made it, or that one felt easy, and so on. And don't forget that you can also violate the rules by making bullets more powerful or making damage less when you are at the edge with those magic tricks that I mentioned quite a while ago. Our game designers have used to essentially sort of cheats at their job in some sense. They, rather than coming up with a perfect balance in numbers, they simply expect that sometimes they're going to miss and the player's going to do poorly, and so they can put in these extra little features to help the player feel like things were better. And speaking more to that point, the game designers know that they are creating an emulation, right? That what they are doing is meant for player experience, and this has come up on and off over the course of the semester when we've talked about the various ways that reality works versus the way that you feel like reality works in a game, right? So Mario does not fall at 9.181 meters per second because almost everyone knows that feels floaty. Now, one of the reasons that feels floaty is often your character is able to jump way higher than you can as a normal human. If you're Michael Jordan, you probably feel like normal physics feels floaty, right? Because Michael Jordan, for those of you who don't know, could jump from the free throw line of the basketball court and make a slam dunk, right? So he could jump over somebody's head and get over somebody's head that was standing in the way and actually still get all the way to the basket, which is like 10 feet away, 10 feet high, and put his arm up and get the ball in the hoop, right? So that guy probably feels like real life physics are floaty simply because he's jumping so high. But our characters also tend to jump high, and so they also feel floaty if we allow them to have normal physics. So we'll sometimes violate that simply because we do want them to allow to jump that high, because it's kind of boring if they only jump a foot or half a foot for their given size. So gravity is one example, but there's also the fact that bullets have a fixed sort of damage that they will tend to do, or a damage range, the amount of power that they will modify, and we're allowing bullets to just subtract from hit points, right, rather than blasting through a wing and causing certain amounts of damage. Now, if on the other hand, our purpose really is to simulate um, an environment. So the experience is kind of the realism of it. So the game, the somewhat game flight simulator, it does have gamey aspects to it. Um, its purpose really is to mimic flight mechanics and to make it feel like to give you as much challenge as maybe you're willing to take on. So they allow you to disable certain complexities within real flying, so you can just sort of experience the basics. But their goal is realism, and so people expect that you're going to crash if you do something really dumb with a 747 bird. You can't flip it. You can't do aerial flips with it. Whereas the game on the right here, we might actually expect this FA 18E Super Hornet to be able to do barrel rolls all the time, because of course the ace pilots always do barrel rolls in movies, and we want to feel like an ace pilot. And so the experience here is that we should be flipping all the time. We should be rolling constantly, going upside down, right? And so sometimes you do want simulation. Sometimes your game or your goal is to simulate some kind of real reality and make the player feel that. But more frequently, it's an emulation of some kind, and your dynamics should reflect that, right? And so you're allowed to do all the cheats in those cases to enable the player experience, the experience that you want them to have, like the ace pilot and the overcoming hero and all those kinds of fun things. So saving and loading, surprisingly, are kind of important to your anxiety, your session length, and all of those things. So um, one of the key ways in modern games that have save points to say that something that you're at a good stopping place is that you actually see the little save icon show up, right? And so that save icon for a medium length period should show up probably much more frequently at 30 minutes, but it should show up at the minimum 30 minutes apart, right? So that you're going through a full session, and you know that in the worst possible case, you have to repeat that full 30 minutes. Now, probably you're not going to even want to repeat that much. You're going to probably only want to repeat the last 5 minutes at most. And so the autosave should happen more often. But maybe the core thing to think about is I think number one is the most necessary. There's no reason to have the player not be able to turn the game off. You don't own the player's life. No matter what kind of game you're playing, how immersed you want the player in your game, they should be able to walk away without losing progress at almost any point, or at least very, very close to any point. Now, whether or not they have to return to exactly that point is up to you as a designer, but you should take into account that people are living lives that aren't in your game, and so they should be able to shut it off at almost any point. Now, things like the PlayStation system, the ability to sort of pause a game at any state, whether or not it's been saved, it sort of just stores the state of the game, is kind of a really great innovation that kind of foregoes this whole saving process. But of course, the PlayStation could crash, and then you lose that state anyway. We might get to a point where these kinds of states are stored into the cloud, and they'll come back. But until that time, you need to at least to have the player not really lose much progress if they just simply have to shut off, or lightning strikes the house or something. Now the sort of number two case here, the other second case that players will use a save. So number one is kind of the important one, and designers should be on the same page with the players. Now number two is your choice to allow the player to do this, right? So the idea here is that this kind of goes back to the allowing to experiment, to figure out what the game's doing as part of their learning towards mastery and understanding a complex system. But they want to protect their current progress against future failure. So their ability to simply just save when something interesting to the player has happened, so that they can get back to at least that point, right? Like, I got the big weapon. I'm going to save this. I'm going to save out in a different name so that I can get back to this point. If all else goes poorly and I start losing the game, I'm going to at least save there. And then kind of the ultimate alternative to that is number three, where they're actually saving simply to explore alternate paths. They're actually trying to figure out what other ways the game can go, and this is kind of the explorer mentality, where they want to figure out the hard corners, and so they're going to keep many, many saves, because they're going to go backtrack and and then go explore, like, well, what if I took the evil path in the morality tree along this branch and see what happens. I just want to see what happens. And if you're going to allow an evil path and a good path, you probably should allow them to do as many saves as they want, so they can go explore that space and see all of the great content that you developed and experience it. They will probably not experience it in the same sort of emotional, high anxiety, low anxiety state that you may have intended, but they will at least experience all the things that you're developing, and so you should maybe encourage that as well. But all this to say that even saving and loading the game suddenly become important parts of the dynamics, and a choice that the designer needs to make in terms of how that's going to play into the way the player experiences things, and especially the session length and where the stock moves, right? So as the stock moves up and down, you are saving the stock state at certain points, or allowing the player to save that stock state. Okay, so we've sort of talked about trying to connect this high level discussion back to the dynamics and the lots of things that we talked about in the semester. Let's come at it from the other end and look at the low level aspects of experience itself, and especially the aesthetics part. So the core raw material of experience is what's known as the theme. And the theme is not so the theme in, say, an essay or a novel, will be like an idea that is reinforced by the essay or the novel, that is described. It comes through in descriptions. It comes through in, the characters and so on. And it certainly can be the case with the narrative aspect of the theme in a game, but there is also the theme of the gameplay itself. So, for instance, persistence and determination triumph any obstacle is kind of almost a description of the core thesis of games themselves, that failure is always an option, and so if you try and try again, you can overcome any obstacle. So that theme resonates with almost every game in some sense. In some games, that's kind of the core, right? Really, that is the kind of the core of Dark Souls game. That if you keep coming at it, you can actually get to the end of Dark Souls and overcome and get kind of a good ending to some degree. Many games do the good conquers evil. That doesn't necessarily come out in the gameplay, although you could look at that as the balancing force, where the evil characters do tend to have a disadvantage over a long enough period of time relative to the good characters, right? So the good character stock grows, the evil character stock sort of remains fixed, and therefore good will conquer evil. But there are other ways that you might be able to look at that too. Perspective is everything is a trick that especially Braid pulled off, I think, in terms of the last level and the ability of the gameplay to show different views of time, and both forward and backward, and the different ways that those play out. And failure is always an option is, of course, a more direct version of the first line, which really just says, failure is always an option is maybe a theme that is resonated in almost any LucasArts game, where you can actually fail, and your hero will not die, and you don't have to sort of reload a save point with a dead character, but they actually get up and they try again because they didn't actually die. They sort of had a bad thing happen, but then they continue to get back on that horse, so to speak. So the way to think about theming then is it's not just the aesthetics, it's not just the art, it's not just the content, but it's something that should resonate through the whole core of the game if you do it right. And that is that you come up with one or two or maybe three themes that your game really represents, and you figure out how to reinforce those with every aspect you can pull off to convince the player that this is what's happening, to sort of ingrain that into the player, the sort of idea that you want them to understand. And it might be good to come up with an idea that is entirely your own, right? These are sort of generic themes in many cases. And so you might have one that's really the nugget of your game, the selling point of your game, the hook of your game, and we'll get back to that when we talk about business stuff, and then you can resonate that theme throughout the whole game experience, to give the player a reminder, a sense of connection to every piece of the game, not just the artwork and whatever else, but also the gameplay and the things that they are doing within the game, that helps to resonate that theme. There's actually this sort of weirdly academic notion called ludonarrative dissonance, which is kind of a point where the narrative theme does not match the gameplay theme. So there are some games where the narrative theme is that I'm the reluctant warrior, right? That I don't really want to have to do this, but you're making me do this, and I'm going to go kill bad guys simply because I have to, but I don't enjoy it. And yet, when you are playing the actual gameplay, you are shooting many people constantly, and you don't necessarily feel any remorse for doing so, because many games sort of just are built around this idea that you're just doing violence, and violence is kind of always the answer. And so it's ludonarrative dissonance, again, a sort of weird name to describe the fact that the narrative theme doesn't match the gameplay theme. And so there's actually a discord rather than a resonance here. And the fact that they don't line up. And so it's certainly worth looking at that and making sure that you can avoid that if you can. Now, I'm not sure that challenge has been solved where you actually feel the impact and remorse of killing people in a game. That would be pretty intense, but for narratives that are trying to pull off that level of intensity, the gameplay should probably match.
So of course, setting is obvious. As we're following along from theme, the way to think about setting is where you are trying to ground your experience. So is it the real Earth? Is it a fantastical Earth? Is it somewhere very foreign to the player? And if it's foreign to the player, how can they become grounded in the experience, right? Is it so foreign that they spend most of their time sort of overwhelmed by the alien nature of the world that they're in? And that's maybe the theme that you're going for, right? So you might have, fish out of water kind of theme, or stranger in a strange land or something like that, where your point is to have the character or the player be unhinged, unhooked from their normal experience. And that's okay, but setting becomes very important in that way. And it also becomes important to think in terms of not just what's possible, but what's plausible, right? So we have certain rules of the world that we expect, and if your setting is a very realistic world, then suddenly having fantastical things is a bit of an aberration. Now, it might be the kind of thrust you want because that's the way you want to introduce that, but you want to do it intentionally. You don't want it to be accidental. You don't want to create a setting which feels very solid, grounded, and realistic, and then make the actual gameplay and the premise, which we'll get to in a moment, fantastical. So setting becomes a very important decision in that case, and especially to understand the way the player, what kind of expectations and framing the player is going to bring to that setting. One interesting way to look at the structure of the setting itself is that it provides bounds on the dynamics of the gameplay. If your world is very realistic, then maybe your gameplay is focused on more realistic things like an adventure game where you're going to, say, pick up various normal things like the mail and clothing and maybe do investigations, right? Whereas if you're maybe in the real world, but you're out there, so let's pick on, say, Lara Croft. It's not exactly fantastical. We expect with Lara Croft in a mysterious island with some connection, given the implication of the story, that there are like ancient artifacts and things like that are there, and so we're allowing some of those to occur. And maybe you rely on the player's suspension of disbelief, but certainly the setting plays a role in setting the player's expectation. So then, taking that expectation further, we consider the premise, which I would think of as maybe an elaboration on the theme. So whereas before we were discussing the theme in terms of, these small statements, right? These almost trite little quotes. The premise would really be kind of the baseline, the sort of beginning of a construct for the story and for the gameplay that helps us start to establish where this is going to go. Right, so it's kind of the starting point with the direction. It's not the full arc of the story. It's just the pointing at where you're going to go, and you still can, the person hearing the premise might still let their imagination run free on where you go from there. So you might, again, going back to Lara Croft, she arrives in a deserted island. She's by herself. It essentially starts with her making it to a campfire and then warming up, right? But now you immediately have survival as kind of the premise, and you have overcoming odds as kind of the theme. Overcoming long odds, and a young woman who's figuring it out, also coming of age, learning to stand up for herself, which is more of, say, the arc itself, but that would be part of the theme. And then the premise here is survival, right? And so we sort of set up a premise, and we say, the gameplay revolves around that. The gameplay revolves around sort of finding small amounts of arrows and using, conserving your ammo, being careful with your ammo, also being quiet and sneaky, all around the notion of surviving. And then that's reinforced too, because some of one of your upgrade paths is survivability. And so those things, again, coming back to the resonant theme, all work through. But the premise is sort of the first elaboration. And then we go to the full elaboration in some sense, right? So this isn't necessarily narrative arc. This is progression arc. And so this is where you start to consider your gameplay style and some, how will the player experience that arc, and what makes sense for what they're doing. A lot of story-based games tend to be really linear, right? So Lara Croft is linear. Uncharted, I believe, is very linear. Some of the games are mostly linear, but will allow side quests with like the hub scenario to allow you to kind of pick and choose. I think of like the more recent God of War game is primarily a linear story, and so the main quest line is really linear. But there's a bit of a hub model in this web show called Girlfriend Reviews, which is hilarious and very clever. So there's a joke where they call it Milfgard, and now I can't remember the real name of it. Midgard. The actual name is Midgard. So in God of War, Midgard becomes kind of a hub where you can stop and take off on side quests. So a lot of games do that kind of thing, where there is a hub for the side quests, but the story, the main story becomes linear. And the reason for that really is that, at some point you might drive straight through the story. Everybody kind of wants to do the other things. Not everybody's going to complete 100% of them. But it lets you pick and choose, and if you're kind of getting, the stories tend to be intense and hard hitting, and so that whole rhythm flow thing, it almost allows players to decide how much of that they want to take, and so you can have a very intense story that's driving forward, but allow for the side quests to be the relief period for the player, and they get to choose when they're going to do that. Often it's also sort of a gameplay relief as well, because if they are banging their head against the linear path, then the hub allows them to level up, and then the linear path becomes sort of easier. There was a time when this was not the standard, but it certainly is now. Okay, and finally we get to the real arc, right? And the arc is always a story arc. You might not necessarily have an explicit one. There's always the arc that you will get out of even a game like, say, League of Legends or Overwatch, or a match-driven game where you do have kind of this sort of arc where you have the beginning area where you're waiting for things to begin. You see who the players are, or at least the players are on your team. You find out what your goal is, and then you start moving in towards your goal. And then there's the crisis you can almost think of as the capture point. That you get to the capture point, you have a massive battle, and there's some kind of resolution, and one team tips the balance to the other, and then it's kind of a foregone conclusion. The falling action is often just very short and kind of the resolution of the game. But you do get that kind of narrative arc out of even a match-driven game like that, if you think about it correctly. Now, I'm maybe belaboring it. We do have stories often in most games now have some story element, and people enjoy the story element. Sometimes that's the only reason to play a game because the rest of it doesn't really fit in. The gameplay doesn't match. It's got a serious ludonarrative dissonance, or it's just something that gets in the way if it's a puzzle game and you just want to play forward. Um, but you can now take this from, if we're looking at the linear narrative, if we're looking at the way the player is going to finally experience everything, then we might look at, say, some of these structures to either, pull out a linear path, which will then follow the narrative arc, or the branching path will have several narrative arcs, but will have different kinds of narration that are happening along the different branches. In the sandbox game, that one and the hub becomes interesting too. It's sort of similar to the sandbox, but in a truly sandbox game, where you really can just sort of wander into anything. If you don't have any ordering that you need to your sandbox, which can be challenging to pull off, one possibility is that you actually have different sandboxes. And so you might have a very small sandbox at the beginning, which kind of represents sort of a tutorial space that you're working in. And then you start to open up and allow the player to experience more of the world, right? See how large it is, sort of the conceal and reveal thing. You start to open up what is possible within this space. And so they're kind of exploring how they want to, and they progress to a certain point. And then there's a tipping point at which then it switches over and there's a new phase. And maybe some of these parts are closed off and now you're open over here. And so you'll see some games do an effect kind of like that, where you can sort of just keep progressing and you can sort of pick the order in which you want to finish a number of missions. I think Mass Effect did that a few different times, where it starts to warn you that you're now about to finish something that is going to be hard to go back to. You can almost think of, if you're going to have a sandbox story sort of driven approach where it's completely disconnected, then maybe you still have some boundaries in here where it falls back to a standard linear plot when the player has progressed far enough to kind of give them that sense of closure, right? That's really what this whole narrative structure does, is sets the player up, gives them sort of a promise of something interesting to happen, gives them the interesting thing, the climax, the resolution, and then the falling action, the sort of how things played out as they go. You sort of get the solid answer, and then you find out the way the world turns. So just to briefly cover these in case they're not necessarily known, these are a number of ways to craft a story within a game while it's happening. So cutscenes are kind of the most well known if you've played a game, and that is where all action ceases and essentially a movie plays out. Sometimes the movie doesn't even necessarily involve your characters. You could have some kind of cutscene from some other action. Often this is kind of the Star Wars approach, right? So if you watch Star Wars, most of the trail of the action that you're following is the protagonist of the story, either Luke or Han Solo or Leia. Then it will cut to something happening with the dark side, right? So Darth Vader and his various generals and lieutenants and whoever he's killing today. And so the cutscenes can kind of pull that moment, and really it's an opportunity to just have a very controlled narrative where you give the continuity of the storyline there, and the rest of the gameplay is simply in between, right? So scripted moments are similar, except that they really don't take you out of they take you out of the gameplay, but they don't necessarily take you out of your situation, right? So it really looks like you lose control of your character, but everything else is the same. So all of the game looks the same, it renders the same. You probably get specialized camera angles as they show more dramatic camera shots in some cases, but you're no longer necessarily in control because they're fully scripted, and so all of the controls are taken over, all of the communication that's happening, and all of the interaction that's happening. So often scripted moments are punctuated by black bars at the bottom and top of the screen, what's referred to as letterbox. So it gives you the indication that you're almost watching a movie, except that that's almost the only distinction, really, especially to begin with, that you're entering a scripted moment. Dialogue driven is especially popular among sort of CRPG, the computer RPG games, where they're trying to reconstruct a lot of the Dungeons and Dragons type feel. And so what they'll do in those cases is you will all of the story will be you talking to people within the world and them explaining things to you, or conversations that happen that essentially play that out. Sometimes there's a narrator that will help explain some of that, but a lot of times all of the story, the way that you understand the world, happens through that. And then they also give you quests and side quests and help you to sort of move through and what you're supposed to complete to kind of move the story along. But that ends up being where all of the story comes from. Triggered events are a little probably similar to scripted moments. They don't necessarily have story and interaction. They're more like, let's see, so if you do the right set of actions, maybe you'll blow down the walls of the city. So they're kind of a scripted moment. They're sort of an event that happens, but they're kind of just you go see the event from that view. It sort of takes you away from your character. Your character's on pause, goes and does the event, and then comes back to your character. So it's a little bit less of a the fully scripted kind of thing, but something interesting happened, and they sort of help you just to progress things. Ambient storytelling is this idea that everything about the world that you can possibly know is built into the environment primarily. So you will sometimes see things sketched, and Portal does this in some ways. So we talked about Portal having sort of the cake is a lie written within some section, very famously. It's not sort of told to you in any way. You sort of go discover it written in graffiti in the world, and you understand. You also learn that the world has more to it, kind of outside the outskirts of the sort of clean lab. You get a dirty world that you're living in. That's an example of ambient storytelling, in addition to the dialogue and the others that the narrator is kind of providing. And then a lot of the sandbox games will tell stories through ambient storytelling. And it feels like a lot of the games that are built around wasteland type worlds. So for instance, Nier Automata or Automata is an example of a game that has a lot of that kind of storytelling, and where there are interesting things, like the world is destroyed in ways that tell you what kind of happened. It's probably not necessarily the same as some game like Gone Home or Everybody's Gone to the Rapture, where it's a bit of a walking simulator and you sort of discover the story that happened. Those are probably closer to scripted moments, triggered events type scenarios, simply because the ambient storytelling is really meant to imply that you're not going to hear active storytelling. You're just going to see things in the world without necessarily, like, you don't have a look command. You don't necessarily have that. It's really just the way the world is structured, and it really relies heavily on the environment artist's skill to represent that world in a way that's clear cut. The player could actually get a sense of that story by having wandered through it. So I'll speak to this in narrative, but this actually comes through in level design as well. So there's both a spine and a golden path. So often in level design, in narrative design, in allowing the player to have agency at all, the ability. So player agency is defined as the ability of the player to choose their destiny, right? The fact that they're in kind of control of the game, and unless you put them on rails and really force them down very narrow pathways, they can actually kind of wander a little bit. And we like that because we want our players to have some sense of agency and some sense of the ability to explore the world and see what's there. And so the spine represents what pieces of the story, what pieces of the level, what pieces of gameplay they need to experience in the order that you need them to, for them to experience the game properly, right? Otherwise it just doesn't make sense. The golden path refers to kind of the optimal path that the designer would want them to take, right? Or at least the sort of baseline path that maybe the designer started with and then could branch out from, sort of add the details to and build from. And in certain cases there might not be one golden path, there might be multiple golden paths. But you might, at least start with that as a beginning. But the spine really represents what the player has to go through. And in level design terms, and then this feeds back into how to get them back on track, which is if the player has wandered, if they've sort of lost the plot, literally or figuratively, then there are some tricks to help them know and understand where to go to get back into where the mainline content is. So of course there are always the indicators. So if you have a game which involves quests and quest indicators and journals, those are sort of mnemonics for the player to help them remember. They give indicators on say radar and map as to where to walk to go find the next thing. But there's another trick that's used that I like to refer to as like the carrot and stick approach, or the Disney path, and it's the idea that you can use things like lights or objects in the distance as guideposts. So carrot and stick is kind of the I'm going to lead my donkey. So if I'm riding on a donkey and I've got a carrot and I tie it to a stick, I can put the carrot out in front of the donkey's nose, and the donkey will walk towards the carrot and sort of move forward through space, right? And so I can guide the donkey that way. So that's very direct, and that's kind of the I'm putting a quest on the map kind of thing. The Disney approach is that the places that are Disney's kind of open world, right? I'm talking about Disneyland or Disney World, or the Magic Kingdom at Disney World, say a self-contained park where you can wander anywhere. There are very interesting things in corners, and so it's worth exploring. If you ever go to Disneyland, or if you have been and you haven't looked around, there are people who talk about the very interesting corners that you can find in the weird places if you go, and Cory Doctorow is one that's very fanatical about Disneyland. A lot of fun to read. But what they do is, so for instance, when you walk into Disneyland initially, they actually put you on kind of rails through narrow paths that make it difficult to see anything. Right, you're on Main Street, and all you can kind of see is the entrance to how you get in. Maybe some information areas and the lost and found and all that kind of useful stuff. And then you start walking down, like you walk down Main Street, and suddenly it opens up a little bit, and at the end of Main Street is a castle, a very large and like noticeable castle that is framed intentionally by the buildings. And so it actually creates sort of a picturesque view that you can stand there and see down this Main Street, see a castle at the end, and it draws you in. Right? It says, "Come see this castle." You were on like this Main Street that looks like buildings and shops and whatever, but there's a castle. Go see the castle. Right? So and at night the castle's very well lit. Right? Main Street's well lit, but you can see the castle as you're walking down Main Street. So it's always kind of this beacon that says, "Go there." And so you can do the same kind of trick in level design to kind of guide the player. So you have dark area. Players are going to avoid dark areas, and they're going to follow the light. Players will also follow where enemies are. So if all else fails, if there's an enemy coming out of a room somewhere, they know there might be a reason to go into that room and follow, figure out where the enemy came from. After, of course, they dispatch the enemy, deal with the enemy as that goes. And so there's these sort of subtle tricks you can use with lights or even sounds, or just some small amount of content like an enemy showing up randomly to suggest that there's something this direction that you should go to, that helps put the player back on track, back onto that spine, and sort of maybe approaching the golden path, but not necessarily, at least getting back onto the spine of the narrative, the level, and really just where the content is and where the interesting things are that you want the player to experience. In both, again, not just your narrative, but in your play as well. So if you have a sophisticated game, then you can, if you've got a sophisticated story, a sophisticated kind of adult thing happening, you might be able to have sort of more complicated controls in a certain sense, in that you could maybe have a menu system where a person has to kind of navigate a little bit to figure out what interesting and complicated thing they need to do, right? But you may or may not have the same, like have an audience that is fully experienced with gameplay, in that they already have a lot of the built-in knowledge about the way A buttons work and X buttons work to be action buttons versus jump buttons versus select or backtrack, and in fact even cultures are different. But also understand that if you have a sophisticated game that you are thinking like very highbrow, that might not appeal to gamers, and non-gamers who you might be targeting, or game people who you might be targeting who might be really interested in something very sophisticated in that way might actually not be gamery enough to be comfortable working really quickly or in a Twitch space, and so you'd have to sort of make those complicated controls very slow motion. You'd have to do a turn-based game or something where they can take a lot of time to ponder it. So these are all things to start to work out with when you're thinking about your audience. Kids games, obviously, you probably want to go simpler, but without necessarily disrespecting kids, because kids are smarter than most people usually give them credit for. But yeah, so it again goes not just to the narrative, but to the gameplay and to the complexity of both and the way those interplay. Okay, so let's move away from narrative entirely, talk a little bit about the other aspects. So again, of the kind of the aesthetic and where content and aesthetic come in. So again, we're kind of at that top piece. We're looking at both the stuff you're creating and the experience that the player is having. And so one of the places that comes in especially is, or one of the ways you start to communicate that is with your concept art. So your concept art becomes very important to give you not just the color palette, right? It certainly lets you get a sense for what kinds of colors you're going for, if it's bright, if it's dark, warm and cold, and all that stuff. It also gives you the mood and starts to let you communicate what the player should be experiencing about it, right? So in top left is a game called Remember Me, sci-fi sort of, a little bit dystopian, sci-fi, futuristic, so there's a little bit of grunginess, but a lot of cool robots and all that. The upper right is BioShock Infinite, which looks sort of bright and happy, but it is sarcastically so. It's kind of you're experiencing something that's overly bright and overly fantastic in a way that isn't in very BioShock sort of sense. And again, the concept art is just a notional thing. It's the feel, the mood, the tone. It is not a view of a specific piece of gameplay, right? You're not necessarily going to see that area from a different angle, but this is maybe especially early on with some of the concepts that you will see, they're just giving you the feel. They don't necessarily need to be a real place. There's sort of a second layer of concept art, which is when you're actually doing a design visualization development for a given level, where you're actually helping the level designers figure out what and where things are. So then, BioShock Infinite, there is kind of the, overblown, everything's happy, kind of a weird, like 1950s United States feel, where it's a little bit too, good, and it really isn't, right? It's rotten at the core kind of thing. So that one's a little bit of a lie, right? So as the designer, as the pitch person for the game, you can go in and kind of sell that other notion of it by using the concept art as the first place, and then speaking to the sort of rotten core feel. And then the final image is again Lara Croft, now referred to that game a few times. This is again the 2013. She's in the jungle. She's alone. You get the overwhelming, she is definitely out of her element and needs to rise to the occasion, right? Which is kind of the core of that gameplay. So all of that is evoked with these images, and you get, if you put together your tone, mood, and style that are coming across from the images that you're communicating, you get the voice that you're trying to use to communicate your idea. And you have on the one hand your idea, and then you have the voice that you use to speak it, and it can be a soft and melodic voice, and it can be a harsh and pounding voice, depending on how you decide to frame things up that way. Okay, so we've kind of gone in depth, quite a bit in depth, on content dynamics, aesthetics, mechanics, and how all of them kind of interplay with each other. But let's talk about the way that we interface both the actions and the feedback. And a lot of this we have already covered pretty fully in depth now. So we've talked a lot about We've talked a lot about dynamics. We've talked quite a bit about content, just in terms of the application of those. We've also talked quite a bit about the way players actually interface with Unreal, for instance, and the way they control the game. We also have talked about the way that the game feeds information back to the player. But to a certain extent, we haven't gone as far as it's possible to go. So, for instance, we've really looked at UIs as like this, large menu system, and of course, UIs have existed that way in many ways. And for certain games, like an RPG like Baldur's Gate, which we have in the upper left here, then we expect to be able to control a lot of things about each of our characters and to see character sheets that look like character sheets from Dungeons and Dragons, or at least modernized versions of those, as well as like inventory spaces where we can control our inventory and have a lot of options that way. So we'd expect inventory like that. But then some games, we almost might want to imagine having the inventory, or the UI stay out of the way. And in some cases, you could even do it in such a way that the things you want to communicate are happening in the world, right? So as the player, or as the character takes more damage because of what the player is doing, the character could start to limp or have blood coming off of them, or just have other issues that cause that. There are other things that, of course, become hard to communicate, like if you do have stamina or something like that, you might still need the stamina bar somewhere. But often it's especially for an action game where you kind of want to stay with the action and you want to stay with the rhythm and tempo that you've set up in terms of your whole level structure and the way that the action unfolds. That may be all you want to have there, and the rest of it is just a minimal amount of information. And of course, you can hide a lot behind, say, the escape key, where they do settings and controls, and of course save and leave the game as well. So there's something to think about in terms of not just that you do need to feed back to the player, but really what do they need to know, what are the important things, and how much can you either embed in sort of the artificial elements, or how much can you embed as almost like an endogenous kind of thing where it happens in world and makes sense that way. And then while you're thinking about feedback, you want to think about, really the interface in total, you want to think about accessibility as well. Because if you limit your audience, then you have fewer people playing your game, and that's not great. So there's some simple things to do that can help out. Things like allowing the UI to resize, to become bigger or smaller, to make important things both visible and audible, so that you're not just relying purely on somebody's ability to hear to play your game. It's very hard to make a game for the blind, unfortunately. A lot of what we do is visual, but it is very possible to make a game for a deaf person that is still certainly able to play. And so it's actually not hard at all to make a game for a deaf person, as long as you don't make strictly audible cues. You allow for visual cues to go along with it, and suddenly it's totally accessible that way. And so there's almost no excuse for that. Now, as far as making games for the blind, there are certainly games that exist, and I think it's great to do, but it is a bigger challenge, and it's harder to speak to easily as the other one. But for people who aren't necessarily blind but visually challenged, like nearsighted or whatever, then having the ability to resize the elements, or to when you change the resolution of the game, you really don't want to change the size of anything. You want it to just be sharper and clearer, right? It used to be in the old days that whenever you increased the resolution on your game, you also decreased the size of everything, because all the UI elements were implemented pixel by pixel, and so they didn't scale up. Whereas nowadays we kind of expect, especially with Apple products, that as we get the higher resolution monitor and keyboard, and display from the Apple product, the actual size of the element stays the same, and we can even potentially scale them up to sort of fit, but they look sharper, right? They look smoother, and that's what we want out of those. So for people that are hard to see, that have a hard time seeing, you can allow those elements to become clearer. And control mapping is always a good thing to do, regardless of whatever whatever you're thinking about the controls. Somebody else needs to be able to alter them right? So some people like the invert look, where you almost get the pilot approach of your controls, that you push down to go up and up to go down. And it seems backwards, but it makes sense if you're in an airplane for whatever reason. And sometimes it makes sense to people who control things that way, and sometimes it doesn't. But not just that, but the ability to change what the A button means and the B button and the triggers and all those is to some degree allowing people to figure out the way they want to map them. You never know what kind of controller somebody's going to have anyway, and they might change it up. But also, some people have specialized controllers for whatever their disability is to allow them to play a game, and so they need to be able to remap the controls to get them into the right position so that it works on the controller that they have that isn't just a standard controller. And so a control mapping is another one of those that it's a little bit of extra work. It's not quite as easy as just adding a visual cue to an audible cue, but it's a good idea for any game to always have control mapping regardless, simply to allow all of your players the ability to deal with that, because you're never going to get it 100% right on the way you map your controls, and so there's no reason not to make it even more accessible just by making all the controls mappable. When you're thinking about the player's actions, there's an example from the Book of Lenses book where it talks about this control where a person's making a basketball game, and so what they choose to do is that the player has to press A to dribble, and so they're pressing the A button over and over to dribble, and it turns out that's terrible, right? Because basketball players don't really think, like professional basketball players don't really think about their dribbling all that much. It's something they do naturally because they've done it for so long that it's already a natural thing that they do. And so it doesn't really make for a fun or interesting experience if you suddenly have to spend as much time learning to dribble in the first place in order to even be able to play the game like a pro basketball player, especially if you're playing like a pro basketball game. And so instead, you just take that out entirely, and the character on the screen, you just get to move the character, and the character on the screen will naturally dribble as they intend to. And the only thing you're making decisions about is when they pass and throw. So it's almost at the level, and we spoke about this in the user interface lecture, where we said that, let's say driving a car, right, where you're no longer thinking about pressing pedals and turning the wheel to make things happen. You're just thinking, I need to get over, and I need to slow down because I'm going to start exiting. And so you think at a higher level when you're working with it that way. It's almost like at this point that maybe you also consider your character, the character the player's playing, has some intelligence, has some agency of their own. They sort of have their ability. And what you're doing is the player is then working on the chunking that the character has. So the character is some kind of professional that already knows how to do something. And so the player is really just controlling their decision process, which is a great place to put the player in, because it will help them to lock into where the character is at whatever point, right? So if we're just talking about professional basketball players, the player doesn't have to worry about maybe lining up a shot necessarily. They choose to when they want to take a shot, right? And the other team is going to decide how they're going to block and whether their timing's right on choosing the block, or whether they should have done a pass play or something. And you don't necessarily make them do a first-person view to aim the shot and go in slow motion or something like that, because that's not quite as exciting as just thinking at the level of a professional basketball player, where what they're not thinking about is how carefully I need to aim. I don't have to think that carefully. I just need to worry about the guy that's trying to stop my shot and get around him and make sure I can get a clear pass over. And I might choose a difference between a chest pass and a bounce pass, or a behind the back trick pass, or a hook shot, or a jump shot, or whatever, right? I'm not an expert at basketball. But those are the kinds of decisions that they make to work around the other team. And those are the more interesting ones. Those are more fun ones to play at that level. And so in the same way, sword fighting game, you generally want to make the decisions at the level of somebody who already knows how to swing a sword, not somebody who is still figuring out how to swing a sword. Again, there's always exceptions, and the game QWOP, spelled QWOP, is a game where you are controlling somebody who's learning to walk, essentially. So you no longer have the ability to just move left and right. You have to actually press the keys in the right way to lift up the thigh and move the calf. And so it's an interesting game in its own right, simply for being at that level. and making a player play at that level. It also doesn't go for very long term. Like it's a short game. It's not an 8 hour long experience where you're working through a full adventure or something, or even a walking simulator where you're exploring a world using QWOP to just barely figure out how to walk. The entire trick is just how far can you get. But yeah, when you're thinking about accessibility, think about action. Think about the player's actions. Think about the accessibility of those actions. Think about mapping the actions. At your level, at the design level, you do have to make the decision to say, no, we're not going to dribble. We're not going to we're not going to have a dribble action at all. We're removing that. They're going to auto dribble. That's a decision you have to make at design time. But then you do say, okay, but we're going to tie normal movement to the left stick, but for whatever reason the player might want to put it on the right stick, and we're going to let them, because sometimes your right stick or your left stick is broken weird and doesn't let you move forward and backward, and you need to switch it over to your right stick, and that's just a thing that happens. Or you're somebody with a disability and actually needs to put it on the right stick for a very specific reason. There's no reason not to have that remapping available.